Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. It's Jeff, aka Godless Scummer, back again. I decided to do something a little bit different today. I did something like this for my patrons, uh, a little while ago, which I actually decided to make public yesterday. And of course, so I should start off by thanking my patrons, Gary Priestley, Dog, Johnny the Apostate, Ox. Thanks very much for your support. So what I released yesterday and made public was a story where I'd looked into a very famous boxing match historically, which was the Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries fight. And I'd been decided I wanted to do something along those lines again as a sort of public video. So I decided I'd have a look into the fight between James J. Braddock and Joe Louis from 1937. Yes, that's correct. So I've been sort of spending the last few days doing a little sort of research on that. And I think I think it's quite a significant fight historically for a number of reasons. Now, for those who saw, those who may have watched the video that I made public yesterday, will know that the significance of the Johnson and Jeffries fight was that it's the whole story around Jim Jeffries being the great white hope against the incumbent champion Jack Johnson, the first ever black heavyweight champion. And that, in a lot of ways, it was about a lot of the racism in America at this time towards a guy like Johnson. And Johnson, as I point out in that, he was a great representative of a lot of the fears that white America had of black people. And that Johnson was Johnson pushed a lot of buttons as a fighter, or the white America just couldn't handle. I'd get a bit more into his story on my video on the Johnson and Jeffries fight. I will actually just warn people. I apologize that I had a little listen back to it today, and some of the quality of it seemed to sort of skip a little bit now and again, but I don't quite know why that happened. Other than the fact that I was using Restream as opposed to StreamYards, and Restream's horrible. So I was going to get into now. This is some 27 years after the Johnson Jeffries fight, and about another 20 or so years since Johnson had lost the title, and no black fighter had ever gotten near having a shot at the heavyweight championship since. And this would be the first time that Joe Louis would get this shot. And I suppose what changed, and why was Louis able to ascend to the top here? Why did he get this opportunity? But also, I think it's important to talk a bit about the other man in this fight, James Braddock. Now, He's become a bit more remembered in recent years, especially since the 2000. Those who've seen the 2005 film with Russell Crowe, Cinderella Man, um, that's the story of Braddock. And Braddock was really he was a fighter in a lot of ways. He was a real hero for Depression era America. In a way that this is a guy who, just a couple of years or so before becoming the heavyweight champion, had been on like welfare. He was a guy pretty much who seemed to be done as a fighter, and who had this amazing comeback. Where and there's this sort of great sort of second run as a fighter where he got right to the top, and what would happen, and how that would happen. So Braddock, James Braddock, he was born in 1905. This was he's born James Walter Braddock. Now, the James J thing was a bit of a homage to a couple of former world champions, Jim Jeffries and Jim Corbett. So that was almost a little bit of a billing, the way that in a way that how he was built. And Braddock was a young kid from Hell's Kitchen area of New York. Very much Irish American family, and Braddock had pursued boxing and turned pro in his early 20s. Hi, Mark. Yeah, and he had a very, very promising had a very promising career, and after just 3 years of fighting, Braddock's professional record was 44 2-2 with 21 knockouts. So it was amazing to think that in just 3 years that a heavyweight's going to fight like 48 professional contests. It did seem that fighters back then really, seemed to fight a lot. And Braddock had made a name for himself by knocking out a highly regarded fighter called Tully Griffiths in 1928. But the following year, he had a chance to fight for a title, but he narrowly lost to Tommy Laughlin on a decision. And during the loss, Braddock fractured his right hand in several places, which would become a recurring issue for Braddock throughout the next few years of his career. That he kept having reoccurring injuries with his favorite right hand as well. And you can imagine how desperate this was for a boxer, who kept having issues with his right hand. To the point where he'd been told by a doctor that they would need to re-break the hand to sort of set it. Braddock couldn't afford to have that done, so what Braddock did was actually ended up taking another fight and deliberately breaking his hand again in the fight, so the doctors could reset it. He couldn't afford to have the process of having it rebroken, and then Braddock would end up he'd fight another over 30 more fights that were far less successful, and out of his next 33 fights, he'd only win 11 of them. He was losing more than he won, and he was really had given up boxing full time, and had to take a day job as a longshoreman, and had even bear in mind this was the Depression, and had actually had to go on welfare, so really was feeling the effects of the Depression. That this was a guy that seemingly had seeming like the highlights of his boxing careers were very much behind him, and now he was going to be just another washed up fighter working a day job. But he did occasionally still get fights, and I mean, there's a story of him like literally picking up a paycheck and going, before even going home, going to make sure buy some basic groceries because they were in that desperate need before he'd even gone home. And this is directly after a fight. But Braddock, ironically, throughout this, all the issues with his right hand, he had started to build, and perhaps working as a longshoreman, so he managed to build up a lot of strength in his left, and was then able to start using his left a little bit more. And then he got a fight against a very highly touted young fighter by the name of Corn Griffin. And Braddock at this time was supposed to be just a journeyman fighter. But Braddock caused a huge upset. He knocked Griffin out in a third round knockout. And then Braddock would have a bit of a revival of his career. Fought some, guys like John Henry Lewis, Art Lasky, for example. He started beating real contenders. And then in 1935, Braddock became the logical heavyweight contender, the number one contender. For a fight with the then world champion Max Baer, and then still, despite this amazing comeback, and the whole story of the Cinderella Man was kind of already a thing by them. Nobody really gave Braddock much of a chance against Max Baer. I mean, Max Baer was a ferocious puncher. It actually had some fight, had actually killed a fighter in the ring. Very few people gave him a chance. But and it was still sort of, this will be a nice, it was sort of thing for you to, this will be, that you get this big fight at Madison Square Garden, be a very nice payday for Braddock, but nobody was really expecting him to beat Max Baer. But during the fight, Braddock actually he took a few big hits from the champion, but but Braddock seemed to wear Baer down and really fought a very, very good fight, winning on points to become really one of the great sort of comebacks in the history of professional sports. Really, I mean, this is Rocky before Rocky's affair. Before that. And for those who've seen the film Cinderella Man, Russell Crowe will probably be familiar, I suppose, with Braddock's story. So there's a bit about Braddock's background and how we get to this. Now, of course, the contender, Joe Louis. Now, Joe Louis is actually, again, like Braddock in a way, fighting somewhat under a bit of a stage name of Joe Lewis's actual name was Joe Louis Barrow. He dropped the Barrow bit from his name for his he was just born in this black kid from rural Alabama, and the seventh of 8 children, but when growing up, Louis had, he suffered from a bit of a speech impediment that he had to overcome. He was, they ended up moving to Detroit because there was some harassment from the Ku Klux Klan. So the family ended up moving to Detroit. And Lewis actually would end up taking up boxing as a kid, but despite in the early despite sort of the early days of the Great Depression, it hit very hard. I mean, there's a very kind of classic story that about Lewis's grandmother wanted Joe Louis to take up violin lessons and learn to play the violin. And he actually did start to learn the violin, but instead of that, he would use the little bit of money that was given to him to go for violin lessons to rent a locker at a boxing gym, and he started learning how to box. And I think he eventually his granny kind of found out, was not happy with him, but kind of eventually acquiesced to to Joe's wishes, and he was really interested in this. And during the early days of the Great Depression, Lewis would start boxing as an amateur. Now, by all accounts, some of his early fights, he wasn't initially, some of his early fights, he got knocked down a lot. He wasn't necessarily a great fighter, so he was very much a work in progress, but would ultimately end up becoming quite successful as an amateur. Eventually, would win a Golden Gloves novice division championship in his area, and then would go on and win more Golden Gloves championships. But eventually, after eventually, by the end of his amateur career, he had a very good record of 50 for 4 with 43 by way of knockout, which is actually, despite some early sort of setbacks, Lewis did end up having a great record as an amateur. He would eventually turn pro, Lewis has about 69 professional bouts, only lost 3 of them, so he has quite an incredible career, and still is obviously regarded as one of the greats. But there were, Lewis was, because of his amateur career, there were obviously some pro fighters took an interest, like promoters took an interest. John Roxburgh, who's actually a known sort of bookmaker and numbers runner. So you can see some of the kind of characters in the fence that were kind of managing Lewis's career. Then some of them were pretty shady. And including there was I'm trying to remember the name of his promoter now. I think it was Mike Jacobs, who will become like his big promoter, and he'll figure a bit in this story as we go along. Lewis really started having an incredible career, though, and would started building up a lot of wins, most of them by knockout, and eventually started getting quite a bit of press. Now, what you've got to remember is we're still talking about a black heavyweight fighter in a time when, America's still very, very racist. And a lot of the promoters were not necessarily willing to go near Lewis, because I think a lot of them felt he's a black fighter. There was a ceiling for black fighters. After Jack Johnson, it was very much, the attitude was, we will make sure there is a black man will not fight for the title again. There was no way they were going to allow a black fighter to become world heavyweight champion again after what had happened with Jack Johnson. And in a lot of ways, Lewis's management really kind of set a lot of ground rules for Lewis about the way to try and overcome some of that prejudice, that he had to sort of behave in a certain way. And they set a lot of ground rules for him. Now, as those who may have seen the video I released yesterday, or those who the patrons may have seen it, may know Jack Johnson, as I said, very much was very much rubbed racist white America the wrong way, because Johnson, not only was he black, Johnson would rub it in their face that he was beating them. He was flashy. He would taunt opponents, and of course, most notably, he would quite often have affairs with white women. You can imagine the kind of thing that, the reaction that they had to this. So with Lewis, it was very much, he had to be presented as the complete opposite of Jack Johnson. There were sort of rules of, don't even be photographed with a white woman unless there's another white man or something there. Those were the sort of rules. Now there are some stories that kind of on the quiet, Joe Lewis had a bit of a phase where he was a bit of a party animal, but was a little more quiet about it. But there was as I said, this was a very, very deliberately crafted image that for Lewis to be, they thought for Joe Lewis to be accepted, they had to kind of craft him as being the complete opposite of Jack Johnson. However, despite a lot of the press he started to get, a lot more of it was still focused on the color of his skin than his ability of a fighter. I mean, there were articles that kind of described Joe Lewis as being lazy, which is of course was a horrible stereotype of black people. Not knowing that Joe Lewis was one of the hardest working boxers in terms of his commitment and his work ethic. But very few people could get past the color line, and it still would very much look like there's no way Joe Lewis is going to get a title shot. It would change, however. The things would change. And Joe Lewis won his first 25 professional contests. No, sorry, no, he won his first 24. His 25th. Now, by this time, Lewis, I gotta say, the promoters had got him to make him look like show that he was very much a contender. He was booked in a number of bouts against former world champions. He knocked out Primo Carnera, an Italian fighter, Primo Carnera, who was a former world heavyweight champion. He knocked out Max Baer, the man who Jim Braddock had defended. But eventually he would come up against another former. In 1936, Joe Lewis would come up against another former world heavyweight champion, a German fighter named Max Schmeling. However, Schmeling caused an upset. He knocked Joe Lewis out in the 12th round. Now, I will touch on this story very quickly. According to legend, former world heavyweight champion Jack Johnson may have played somewhat of a role in this defeat for Lewis. And what happened? What happened was that allegedly Jack Johnson had kind of offered to help assist with Lewis's training, but as they wanted to distance themselves from the image of Johnson, Lewis's cap blew off Johnson, and allegedly it was Johnson who had spotted the weakness in Joe Lewis's game, that when he went to throw a right, he sometimes had this habit of letting his guard down when he threw a punch, and would leave himself open to like a right hand or something from and allegedly it was Johnson who tipped Schmeling off about this. I can't, however, I don't think that story can actually be corroborated as fact. It does almost sound like something that Johnson himself may have put out. So what I'm going to get to in a second, and is the fight itself, because I'm going to be showing the fight itself and talking a bit along with it, similarly to what I did with similar to what I did with the Johnson Jeffries fight. So this was a huge setback. Lewis would get a little bit of the steam back when he would knock out another former champion in Jack Sharkey in his next bout. But really, at this point, it was very clear Max Schmeling was really the number one contender for Jim Braddock's title. However, I think at this time, a lot of attitudes towards Germany were changing. Schmeling, despite the fact that Schmeling himself was never a Nazi, I don't know, he may have possibly have been a member of the party at one point for convenience, but Schmeling was never a Nazi. He never held with the ideology. Even actually would use his name occasionally to actually help some like Jewish families escape persecution under them. But after the Lewis bout, it was that the propaganda machine in Nazi Germany very much got behind Max Schmeling. And he was really at this point was the logical contender to try and win, get a shot at winning the title back from Braddock. The American promoters were desperately afraid that if Schmeling won and beat Braddock, that belt was going back to Germany, and it was going to be a propaganda piece for Hitler, and it just was not, they did not want that, and they felt they would never get the belt back. So in a couple of seconds, right, I'm going to actually get to the fight itself. But the thing was, that situation left the door open for Joe Louis, and the fact that there was probably, despite a lot of the racist kind of attitudes of white America, I think it was maybe sooner another black champion than a German world champion at this point in time. So let me add this to the stream. Okay, so I'm going to start playing the fight footage and talking a bit about this. There is a little bit of sound with this, but there's no commentary. So there is a little bit of sound. Now, bear in mind, this is 1937. So this fight took place at Comiskey Park, the baseball stadium in Chicago, June the 22nd, 1937. And Braddock at this point, I don't think Braddock had fought for a little while at this point. He actually had not fought for 2 years since defeating Barrett, and he had not defended the title, which... So, yeah, this music will be out of the way in a second. But yeah, so Braddock has not fought in 2 years at this point. Lewis, of course, had in the time since Braddock had won the championship, he'd fought Bat Bayer, he'd fought Schmeling, he'd fought, he had fought Primo Canero, all in this time. Interesting, Tusk. Yeah, I don't know much about the history of German boxing, honestly. So they come into the ring. So this had, like I said, this had left the way open for Lewis. Lewis's promoter, who I mentioned earlier,
champion of the world,
had really made Braddock an offer, a really great financial offer, and
his weight 197 pounds. The challenger from Detroit, Joe Lewis.
Mike Jacobs, yes. Why did I forget his name? I had him in front of me in my notes.
His weight 197 and
I'm going to mute this because it's kind of distracting me a little bit, but I'll unmute it a bit when. Now, part of the deal for this fight was that going forward, Braddock would get 10% of all of Lewis's fights, like all the promotional money. How much of that actually came directly out of Joe Lewis's own cut of this has never been documented, but given boxing promoters being boxing promoters, I would expect quite a significant amount came out of this. Now, I'm going to turn the volume back up here a little bit. Interestingly here, the champion was introduced first. Now, as the fight begins, I mean, now, just because it's black and white footage here, I mean, it should be very obvious to tell who's who, but one big difference you'll notice, for those of you who saw my footage of the Johnson-Jeffries fight, is the referees are starting to break them up now. This whole tying people up for like a minute at a time is like just doesn't happen anymore. But this fight would get very dramatic very early, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. That Lewis, in this feeling out process, it would get very dramatic. But Braddock would land some shots in a second. So there's no commentary, but you can kind of hear the crowd. This isn't like a silent film. And you see there, Joe Lewis is knocked down early in the fight. Now, right, I'm going to put the sound off this. Joe Lewis is knocked down very, very early, but his own cornerman, I actually kind of had a bit of a shout at him about this afterwards, saying, "Look, you can stop. You could have just taken the 8 count here. You didn't have to. But if you notice, there's a knockdown, and Lewis sort of almost bounces straight up. It's So, as I said, really, this should have been Max Schmeling's fight here. This should have been his opportunity. They didn't. Now, of course, Max, we'll get to this in a bit. Max Schmeling would get another opportunity at the World Heavyweight Championship, and it wouldn't go quite so well. But and you really, even though this fight, if you look at this, and you really look at this, it still is a lot different from modern boxing. It still is a lot different, but when you compared it to, it stands up more, this fight, than the Johnson-Jeffries fight. As the Johnson-Jeffries fight, despite its cultural significance, probably wasn't a great boxing match. It was a lot of holding, which, and you see how boxing has changed in like the 27 years since then. And you got to imagine, in a way, Braddock may be a bit of a sentimental favourite here. He was a hero to Depression-era America. But I think Lewis obviously very much a hero to Black America, though. And would he become... And Lewis, in a way, over the next few years, would become kind of a hero to all of America. Possibly being the first African American to be, I suppose, widely accepted. And as you see here, at this point, it's still very much a feeling out process. But despite that early knockdown, you see Lewis starts to assert himself in this fight. Braddock, though, does not give up in easily. But you start to see here that Lewis is starting to get into it now. Now, to get into the third round, obviously, a bit about Braddock after he sort of retired from fighting. Really, Braddock seemed to live a bit more of a quieter life, but he did enlist in the U.S. Army himself as a first lieutenant during the Second World War. Actually served in the Pacific Theater on the islands of Saipan. He actually trained enlisted men in hand-to-hand combat. And then when he came back to the United States, his main thing was that he sold military surplus. And actually, as well, it was weirdly was involved in as a supplier. He helped in the construction of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which connects New York and Staten Island. Braddock died in 1974 at age of 69. He's buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Tenafly, New Jersey. Was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame in 2001. And as I said, but was largely forgotten, probably until they actually made the film Cinderella Man. And I think, I suppose Braddock's legacy has been somewhat recovered in recent years, because it is quite an amazing story of a comeback. But Lewis, as you know, would play a very significant role during the war. He wasn't on the front lines or anything like, but he was very much involved, and he was a celebrity. He entertained the troops. I don't think I'm giving any spoilers away by that most people were probably aware who wins this fight, but obviously Joe Louis will become the champion. As you see this fight here now, Braddock is still there. Braddock's still fighting. But you start to see that Joe Louis starts to work those jabs and get those hits in. It's becoming you see as this goes that the younger contender here is starting to assert himself. Now, when you look at Joe Louis, actually would end up doing quite a lot. And I should make this point that Joe Louis during the 60s, I think got very, very unfairly labeled an Uncle Tom by some black athletes. Muhammad Ali famously called him that once, and I think it's very, very unfair to Joe Louis. Joe Louis did a lot when he was in the U.S. Army to combat segregation within the Army. Joe Louis actually, weirdly enough, after really it is when he was getting near the end of his boxing career, weirdly played a role in getting sport of golf desegregated. Like that he was involved with the first ever PGA tournament that allowed African Americans to compete, because there was a little thing the PGA did with a certain tournament where the world heavyweight champion was invited as a sort of celebrity contestant, but then of course the rules of the club were Caucasians only. Louis kicked up enough of a stink about that. So Louis, was maybe not as outright a militant, say, or as outspoken as some athletes were in the 60s, but and I think possibly he didn't. Joe Louis was a product of his time, but to say that he was an Uncle Tom is really, really unfair to the man. And I think a lot of people, I think it was very, very much in later years, it comes like just how much Joe Louis did to combat segregation in the Army. That he had the clout to do it when he was enlisted in the Army. But as you see now, you're starting to see Louis is landing the shots. Braddock's swinging a bit more wildly now. But Braddock,
Hang on, Jim.
you hear them sort of shouting, "Hang on, Jim, hang on." You see how this fight's going.
Hang on, Jim.
You really, at this point, you're starting to see how this fight's going. I mean, one of the things you definitely see, as I said about the whole way, you see like the whole way Lewis, unlike Jack Johnson, Lewis was never taunt fighters, even if he was dominating them. But there was a point in this fight, really, where I believe Braddock's own corner is kind of wants to throw in the towel and say, look, stop this fight. Braddock wanted to, I think Braddock had that very much a fighting champion. No, I'm going to lose. I'm going to lose on the canvas. Braddock very much had that attitude. But at this point, it's becoming pretty obvious which way this fight's going. That there's a noble effort by the champion, but Lewis is clearly the better man here. And you see Braddock is fading. At this point, Braddock is very much fading in this fight now. And so they come out for the 8th. And it does seem like, obviously, it's difficult to judge because of the film quality. There is sounds here, but you kind of wonder if it does sort of sound like now as if the air's gone out of the crowd a bit, because I'm assuming Braddock was probably the sentimental favourite here. It's odd, but it's becoming obvious now. Lewis is winning. Braddock's fading. And he's not getting his hands up. Lewis is jabbing away. And then that is it.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Now,
9, 10.
That's it. And that was it. Now, to be honest, the referee didn't need to count at that point. Lewis actually hit Braddock so hard that Braddock was out cold for, from some stories, say around 15 to 20 minutes, according to some stories. I mean, it was a huge this was also the only time throughout Braddock's career that he was actually knocked out. Despite all those fights he lost, he'd never been stopped. This fight he stopped in a brutal fashion. And Joe Louis is the heavyweight champion of the world. And you sort of see at this point, I mean, you see Braddock's not moving. Joe Louis, you see, he's not celebrating too much. I mean, he obviously raises his hands, but you have to understand that, again, part of this way that Lewis...
New champion of the world, Joe Louis.
And you can see there's a bit of a mixed react. If you hear that, there's a bit of a mixed reaction for Comiskey Park. It does seem so. That was the fight. Lewis, of course, in later Lewis would go on and have Tusk, indeed, and that was a big part of the way Lewis was marketed. It was don't be seen taunting or jeering over a fallen opponent, especially if he's a white opponent. They didn't want. This is why Jack Johnson infuriated white America a lot more. Maybe in a way, Lewis was able to be accepted. Now, of course, Lewis would go on and have an incredible reign with the championship. And he won the world championship in his 33rd fight. It would not be to his 60th fight until he lost. He made defenses against the British fighter Tommy Farr, who coincidentally Tommy Farr was sort of viewed as the number one contender. But Jim Braddock would fight only one more fight after the Lewis fight, and he fought Tommy Farr and beat him. Braddock got to go out with a win, but there were a number of fights that happened before it. Obviously, Lewis had to confront Max Schmeling, and that fight would take place in 1938 in Yankee Stadium, New York. This time it went very differently, and this fight was very politically charged. By this time, it was kind of Lewis was seen as being built very much as America's hero against this German Nazi menace in Max Schmeling. And the irony, as I said, is Schmeling was no Nazi himself, and Lewis, of course, the champion of America, like being hailed as the champion of America and everything American freedom, didn't enjoy the same freedoms because of his skin color as most Americans. One of the great ironies is that Lewis and Schmeling in later years would become very good friends. And I think it's quite well documented that all the things Joe Lewis did, he got, donating purses of his to the war effort, and really after the war, the IRS just came for Joe Lewis and back tax and hounded him for years. He ended up really fighting a lot longer than he should have been, and Lewis would eventually lose the World Heavyweight Championship in 1950 to Ezra Childs. Lewis would go on and fight another 9 fights after this. He won 8 of them, most of them by decision. Now, he wasn't knocking many people out, but he finally fought his last fight in 1951 against Rocky Marciano, who knocked him out in the 8th round. And famously, Marciano idolized Lewis and kind of wept when he knocked him out. It's Lewis's obviously had the weird thing was Lewis himself had got ripped off by a lot of fighters done by promoters, and it's estimated that over the $4.6 million that he earned during his boxing career, it looks like he only received about 800,000. When he famously, during the war, he went in and just took a soldier's salary, and donated some of his purses to the war effort. During this time, he never really stopped spending, and he ended up borrowing a lot of money from his promoter Mike Jacobs, who of course wanted it back. Lewis was hounded for years afterwards. He obviously had a stint as a professional wrestler for a little while. Would later, I think, would get to a point where there was a deal where he would made a deal with the IRS, but he kind of ended up as a sort of like one of these celebrity doorman types in Las Vegas. Quite a sad end, really. But when he died in 1981, there was a big there was a bit of a I mean, Lewis had been ill for a while. He'd actually a few years before had to go into rehab for drugs. It was quite sad. He died. Now, according to the rules, he was ineligible for burial at Arlington National Ceremony, but the then President Ronald Reagan actually waived the rules on that, and was buried there with full military honors. And the funeral was paid for in part by Max Schmeling, who was a pallbearer at Joe Lewis's funeral. So they had a very interesting relationship, and apparently Max Schmeling, who had a very one of the more successful post-boxing careers after the war. I mean, he was during the war, he was basically made to be a paratrooper in the Wehrmacht, I think it was, and pretty much, I think, was on the Russian front. Don't quote me on that. I haven't really double checked that. But Schmeling did very well for himself as being, he was able to buy into a Coca-Cola franchise in Germany and did very well for himself financially. And actually, as I said, he helped Joe Lewis. He actually helped out Joe Lewis's family a bit with funeral expenses and even with some of the debts. So as I said, Schmeling never believed in that ideology. So really, in a sense, you could say that although this is the story of the Braddock Lewis fight, Max Schmeling is a big part of this story too. So there it is. I've been going about an hour. I know that most of the people actually view my channel are not really sports people, but I wanted to maybe do a few videos on. I've done a couple now on boxing matches. If there's other sort of sports events that I could do with some sort of a historical significance, I'm all for doing that. I'm a bit more reluctant to show footage from, should we say, modern day sporting events because of copyright issues. But if there's a story to be told in this, people I think should hear some of these. Okay, so this has been Jeff, aka Godless Scummer. I will be streaming tomorrow, which will be the 11th of March 2021. This is the date I'm streaming now. Hope some of you enjoyed that. Bit different from my normal content, but hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm Jeff, God the Scummer. So see you guys later. Salute.